In this presentation, I'm going to look at the testimony of Otto Ohlendorf at Nuremberg on the 3rd of January 1946. This testimony is extremely important because Ohlendorf answered honestly and openly and didn't try to hide anything. It gives really good insights not only into the murder of the Jewish population by his Einsatzkommando, but also into the functioning of the Nazi state and the various organs of repression within it. He also states what was his relationship with others then on trial. In this video, you will get a complete version of what he testified to in open court. Otto Ohlendorf studied law and economics, and had Hitler not come along, or had Hitler won the war, he could have expected a career in government where he would have been able to use these skills. In his testimony, not only at the main Nuremberg trial, but also at his own, and in his interrogations, he demonstrated a good knowledge of both. Otto Ohlendorf, aged 38, born Hohen-Egelsen, testified that he joined the National Socialist Party in 1925, the SA also that year, the SS in 1926, and the SD, that is to say the Security Service, in 1936. In the Reich Security Main Office, that is to say the RSHA, he was head of Department 3, which was the Domestic Intelligence Section of the SD. He did this from 1939 to 1945, but this was on a part-time basis. In court, he confirmed that the organisational chart, which was shown there at Nuremberg, correctly represented the RSHA and the positions of the SD, the Gestapo, and Kaltenbrunner within the German police system. He had helped create that chart during his interrogation and stated that it accurately reflected the structure as he knew it. Ohlendorf explained that many of the instruments of repression that, in theory, were arms of the state were in fact arms of the National Socialist Party. He described the RSHA as effectively the office of the Chief of the Security Police and SD, combining ministerial and executive functions, but formally a camouflage designation. Legally, many of the component officers still derived their authority from the Ministry of the Interior or from the party, not from the entity called the RSHA as such. For example, the Political Police Office formally remained part of the Interior Ministry's Police Department, and the Prussian Secret State Police Office continued in name as the central office for the political police of the individual German states. The SD's departments remained party offices. The RSHA, as an SS main office, mainly provided an internal, practical amalgamation of forces, while formally these organs still had ties either to the Ministry of the Interior or the party. Himmler, as Reichsführer SS, did not give the RSHA independent state-level authority separate from these legal structures. Within this structure, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, from the 30th of January 1943 until the very end of the war, was Chief of the Security Police and SD, and therefore head of the RSHA. Heinrich Müller was Chief of Department 4, that is to say the Gestapo, having previously been Deputy Chief when the Gestapo was first formed. He served in that capacity until the end of the war. Adolf Eichmann worked under Müller in Department 4 on what the Nazis would have termed the Jewish problem from around 1940 and, to Ohlendorf's knowledge, remained in that post until the end of the war. Kaltenbrunner, after taking office, had to concern himself with the Einsatzgruppen questions and thus must have known about their functioning, which fell under his offices. Ohlendorf explained that the concept of Einsatzgruppe first appeared in the Polish campaign, but the definitive arrangement with the army, the OKH, and the Supreme Military Command, the OKW, was concluded just before the campaign against the Soviet Union. According to him, a written agreement existed between the OKH, the OKW, and the RSHA regulating the use of the security police and SD units in operational areas. He stated he was present at many of the negotiations conducted by Walter Schellenberg with the OKH and OKW on behalf of Heydrich, and that he personally held and used a written copy of the agreement when he took over his Einsatzgruppe. He remembered the letterhead as OKW OKH, which he had found unusual and which he associated with the involvement of Admiral Canaris. He couldn't recall the signatures, but remembered it as a mimeographed sheet. He believed the agreement itself did not mention the liquidation mission. If there was a description of tasks, it would have been in general terms, and he was certain the liquidation function was not written there. He summarized the substance of the agreement as follows. In the operational zones of the army, the mobile units of the security police and SD, that's the Einsatzgruppen, would be employed. Each army group was to have an Einsatzgruppe attached to it, which would in turn be subdivided into Einsatzkommandos. The army group or army would be responsible for the movement and supply of these units, while the chief of the security police and SD would give them instructions in relation to their work. The operational area of each Einsatzgruppe was determined by its attachment to a specific army group and its movement within that group. The operational areas of the subordinate Einsatzkommandos were fixed by the army group or army. Although the security police and SD leadership retained the right to issue instructions, there was a general understanding that the army could also issue orders to Einsatzgruppe if the operational situation so required it. A liaison officer existed between the Army Command and the SD. Ohlendorf stressed that he had no direct orders from the OKW himself. He knew only the wishes and orders of the army under which he operated. He then turned to his own role. From June 1941 until Heydrich's death in June 1942, he commanded Einsatzgruppe D and served as the representative of the Chief of the Security Police and SD within the 11th Army. He recalled that Heydrich was wounded at the end of May 1942 and died on the 4th of June 1942. He received about 4 weeks' notice of the campaign against the Soviet Union. There were 4 Einsatzgruppen for that campaign. Einsatzgruppe A under Stahlecker, B under Niebuhr, C under Dr. Rasch and later Dr. Thomas, and D under himself, later to be succeeded by Bierkamp. Einsatzgruppe D was attached not to an army group but directly to the 11th Army. Einsatzgruppe D operated in what is today southern Ukraine. He described its area as extending from Chernauty in the north, southward towards Mogilev-Podolsk and Yampol, and then eastward through a series of places such as Zuvale, Chervind, to Melitopol, Mariupol, Taganrog, Rostov-on-Don, and then back to the Crimea. The group was held in reserve for an army group that was to operate in the Caucasus. Einsatzgruppe D departed from the Düben Heath on the 21st of June 1941, reached Pietranamsk in Romania in 3 days, and was partially committed at once because the army demanded Einsatzkommandos. The entire group was in action, as he put it, by the beginning of July 1941. He stated that before the Soviet campaign, there was a conference at Prech, 3 or 4 days before the Einsatzgruppen set out, where the chiefs of the Einsatzgruppen and the commanders of the Einsatzkommandos were informed of their tasks. At this meeting, Bruno Streckenbach of the RSHA transmitted the orders of Heydrich and Himmler. Ohlendorf said that besides general directives concerning normal security police and SD work, an order was given for the liquidation of Jews and Soviet political commissars in the area of operations. He confirmed that, before marching into the Soviet Union, he knew he and his men were ordered to exterminate Jews and communist functionaries, in addition to carrying out ordinary police and security work. He received further information in a private conversation with Himmler, who told him that prior to the Russian campaign, Hitler had addressed a conference of army group and army commanding generals, speaking of the mission of the Einsatzgruppen and ordering the generals to provide necessary support. Ohlendorf emphasized that the order to liquidate came from Himmler, not the army. The army's role was to support these operations in its operational area, without which the Einsatzgruppen could not have functioned. In the late summer of 1941, Himmler visited Mykolaiv, gathered the leaders and men of the Einsatzkommandos of Einsatzgruppe D, repeated the liquidation order, and told them that they bore no personal responsibility for carrying it out. He said that full responsibility lay with Himmler himself, and then, of course, with Hitler. Ohlendorf said that it was Himmler who had told him this. He stated that the commanding general of the 11th Army, first Eugen Ritter von Schober, who was killed on the 12th of September 1941, later Erich von Manstein, who replaced him, knew of the liquidation order and the murders through conferences with the army and through instructions issued by the army regarding the execution of the order. At Mykolaiv, an order from the 11th Army directed that executions were not to be carried out within 200 kilometers of army headquarters. At Simferopol, the army command requested the Einsatzkommandos in the area to accelerate liquidations because of impending famine and acute housing shortages. Ohlendorf added that while the army as an institution did not officially assign units for executions and was inwardly opposed, individual units attached to the army sometimes volunteered. He could recall no such case for regular army units, but only among auxiliary formations. He believed that, generally, commanding generals of other armies must have also have known of these operations, since Himmler had told him Hitler had spoken to all commanding generals about this. On the internal awareness of the mission, he testified that at least some RSHA leaders knew about the Einsatzgruppen, since many had served in them, and others dealt with their organisation and legal aspects. The leaders of the Einsatzgruppen and Einsatzkommandos came from all over the Reich. He did not accept that they were drawn predominantly from the RSHA alone. Ohlendorf then described in detail how the mass murders under his command were carried out. A local Einsatzkommando had the Jews in its area registered, usually by the Jewish Council of Elders. The pretext given to the victims was that they were to be resettled. Once registered, Jews were assembled in one place and then transported in trucks to the execution site, typically an anti-tank ditch or a natural depression in the ground. He said only as many people were taken at one time as could be killed immediately, in order to minimise the period between their realisation of their fate and the moment of death, which he believed reduced both their nervous strain and the psychological burden on the murderers. Executions were conducted in a military manner by firing squads under his command. Victims were shot while standing or kneeling. Afterwards, the unit commander or a designated subordinate had orders to make sure all were dead and to finish off any who were not. The bodies were then buried in ditches or in depressions in the ground. The graves were filled in by the commandos and later levelled by labour units from the local population to conceal the evidence. As to property, he said that, at or shortly after registration, valuables were confiscated, sometimes through the Jewish Council of Elders, and turned over either to the RSHA or directly to the Reich Ministry of Finance. Personal property was not completely itemised. Only valuables were formally registered. At first, clothing taken from the victims was distributed to the local population. In the winter of 1941-42, clothing was collected and handled by the NSV, that is the National Socialist Welfare Organisation. Immediately before execution, victims were required to remove their outer garments. Other clothing remained on the bodies, in the case of his Einsatzkommando. Watches at the request of the army were given to frontline troops. Gold and silver went to Berlin to the Reich Finance Ministry. He remembered that this was done from Simferopol and said in general the goal was to prevent looting and to ensure central collection of valuables, which he considered to be part of his duty. He said that he personally was present at 2 mass murders for inspection purposes on his own initiative, and whenever possible he sent a staff officer to observe killings to verify that his conditions were met. Exclusion of the public, executions to be carried out in a military manner by firing squads acting under orders, orderly transport and liquidation to avoid panic, and supervision of property to prevent looting and ill treatment. By ill treatment he meant situation in which the victim's distress led to disorder or resistance, and the commandos restored order by violence, such as beatings. He had heard of such incidents from members of other commandos, though he said he had not personally witnessed such beatings. He estimated that between June 1941 and June 1942, the Einsatzkommandos of Einsatzgruppe D reported around 90,000 people liquidated, including men, women and children. This figure came from written reports that commandos sent to the Einsatzgruppe and which he personally read. In comparing this with other Einsatzgruppen, he said that the figures he had seen for them were considerably larger, though he believed they might be exaggerated. Regular reports of these executions were sent by the Einsatzgruppe to the Chief of the Security Police, initially Heydrich personally, and after his death in the same manner to his successors. He said that when he left, this reporting system continued. He stated that the order was to exterminate the entire Jewish population, including children. In response to questioning, he said that children were killed because the order required the total elimination of all Jews. His orders were also to kill any Communist Party commissars that were captured. However, there was no specific effort to locate the families of these commissars. Mere membership of the Communist Party was not sufficient reason for execution. The person had to hold a special political function, such as that of activist or political commissar. He described the introduction of gas vans in the spring of 1942. Himmler ordered that, from then on, women and children were to be killed in gas vans rather than by shooting, allegedly so that they would not endure the mental strain of witnessing executions, and so that married men in the commandos would not have to aim directly at women and children. The vans were delivered as a special unit assigned by the RSHA and headed by their inventor, August Becker. They were normal-looking closed trucks in which exhaust gas could be directed into the sealed compartment when the motor ran. According to him, 15 to 20 people could be killed in one van at a time, death taking about 10 to 15 minutes during the drive to the burial site, usually the same place as used for the shootings. Victims were told that they were being transported to another location. He said he didn't know the technical details of gas delivery. He stated that doctors who observed reported to him that the victims were not conscious of their death in the van. He didn't recall precise numbers, but believed that in total the amount of people killed by gas at vans by his group was comparatively small, perhaps a few hundred. It is worth pointing out that he stated that he didn't know a great deal about the vans, which, as we now know, could kill far more people at any one time. Furthermore, the gassing was done whilst the vehicle was stationary. The hose from the engine was disconnected from the interior of the vehicle when it was moved to the location where the victims' bodies were to be buried. Ohlendorf had read, during his interrogation, the letter from Becker to Rauff about gas vans, which was in evidence, and he identified it as authentic based on the letterhead, the initial R for Rauff, and references to transportation officials he knew. Now, there is a letter about the gas vans, and I'll do a separate video on this at another time. However, as far as this letter is concerned, its contents corresponded generally to his experience. He said that the Einsatzkommandos didn't like to use the gas vans. He testified that leaders reported that unloading the corpses was an enormous psychological strain because of the condition of the bodies and the state of the van, including bodily functions, leaving corpses lying in filth. He said that for these reasons, the men preferred shootings to gas vans, although he maintained, based on the doctor's statements, that the victims were not conscious at the moment of death. This point was questioned in court. He also contrasted his insistence on military-style executions by firing squads with the method used elsewhere, that of shooting individuals in the back of the neck. Some unit leaders in other Einsatzgruppen used the neck shot method. He opposed it, he said, because it required individual executioners to make personal decisions about killing and greatly increased the psychological burden on both victims and executioners. His aim, he testified, was that the men carry out orders as if it were a military mission, without having to make individual decisions, and that executions be conducted rapidly to minimize panic, disorder, and ill treatment. He believed that the basic liquidation order was never formally revoked. However, the retreat from Soviet territory reduced the operational area of the Einsatzgruppen. He knew that Einsatzgruppen with similar orders had been envisaged for other areas. He'd seen a document sometime late in the war terminating the liquidation of Soviet commissars, and he believed that the liquidation of Jews was prohibited about 6 months before the end of the war, and that these orders were in fact carried out, although he couldn't recall precise dates for each. He estimated that his Einsatzgruppe initially had about 500 men excluding local auxiliaries, and that other Einsatzgruppen had roughly 700 to 800 men at the beginning, later expanding as they obtained more personnel from the RSHA and other sources. In his own group, he estimated about 100 Waffen-SS men. Each Einsatzgruppe was supposed to receive one company of Waffen-SS and one company of Ordnungspolizei, the order police. The bulk of these experts, and I use experts in inverted commas, came from the state police and criminal police. The Waffen-SS and order police provided most of the rank-and-file troops. He knew of no death's head, that's the Totenkopf, units being used, and believed the actual Waffen-SS units attached were varied. He couldn't name any specific formation. Ohlendorf provided extensive details on the SD, Gestapo and police structure. He said he became Chief of Department III, the SD Home Intelligence Service, which dealt with internal political and social intelligence. He explained that the term SD was often used incorrectly to mean both security police and SD, even though the SD was originally simply a party intelligence organisation whose members wore SD insignia. After the SD main office was dissolved in 1939 and its functions incorporated into the RSHA, there were discussions of changing the insignia to RSHA, but this was not done because it would have compromised the camouflage of the RSHA. Therefore, orders and directives sometimes referred imprecisely to SD, even when no SD office existed, as for example in France. He emphasised that SD departments, like Department 3, had no executive powers. They were simply intelligence agencies. He dated the origin of the SD to around 1932, initially as the party's intelligence service, observing opponents and providing information. After 1933, and more significantly from 1936 to 37, it evolved into a domestic intelligence service, focusing less on individuals and more on technical matters, namely the effects of government measures and public reactions. After the 1939 reorganisation and dissolution of the SD main office, handling political opponents was formally removed from the tasks of the SD. Its job became just to observe the impact of policies, report social moods, and provide objective criticism to higher authorities. It never received formal party legitimation for this critical work, but said Reich Marshal Goering later gave it some recognition because he was able, at Reich Defense Council meetings, to use SD reports to point out harmful developments. He described the domestic SD as virtually the only institution in the Reich systematically carrying out such critical reporting. As to numbers, he said that Department 3, the Internal Intelligence Service, had about 3,000 salaried members, both males and females, and worked mainly with about 30,000 honorary collaborators who provided information from their professional and social environments, most of whom belonged neither to the SS nor, for that matter, to the party. He estimated that in the field units, Einsatzkommandos might have only 2 or 3 SD experts each, so the SD contribution within operational formations was numerically small. On the Gestapo and political police, he said that prior to 1933, there had already been political police departments in places like Berlin, such as the Police Department 1A, which had very similar tasks, which were to combat political opponents and protect the state. Around 1933 to 34, political police officers were established in all the individual German states. In 1934, Himmler became chief of the political police in the states, and the Prussian state police, called the Gestapo, initially under Goering, became the central model. After the creation of the main office of the security police, control passed from Himmler through Heydrich and his central office. The core of the expert personnel in the state police came from the criminal police and from career civil servants drawn from the civil and police administrations. Many people were seconded to the state police from the civil service and, as government officials, couldn't simply refuse. At best, someone might have avoided getting involved with the Gestapo by what could be described as a cunning plan. He believed that by the end of the war, the total Gestapo strength, including regional officers and personnel in occupied territories, was around 30,000 people. Many Gestapo employees were administrative officials or staff who had nothing to do with operational activities. He thought a ratio of 1 specialist to 3 or 4 non-operational staff was plausible. He attributed overall direction and administration of concentration camps to SS Obergruppenführer Pohl. According to his knowledge, the Gestapo was not responsible for running the camps. Only state police investigative officials might work in or visit camps, but he saw no evidence that the Gestapo as an organisation managed camp administration or internal measures. Concentration camps were matters of the Reich under SS control, not local party or Gestapo institutions, and the connection between Gauleiters and the camps was, he thought, relatively loose. He described the relationship of SS and Gestapo as one in which Himmler, as Reichsführer SS, took over police tasks and tried to fuse the state police and SS both by recruiting SS-eligible personnel into the state police and by using SS training institutions such as the Waffen-SS to educate future police recruits. He said that this amalgamation was later broadened to attempt a similar relationship between SS and the entire internal administration. He also discussed the chain of command and relationships with party functionaries. State police, criminal police, and SD leaders in the regions acted as police or political advisors to the Gauleiters or Reich governors and were supposed to report to them on their respective fields. It was therefore inconceivable to him that state police could carry out such extensive operations over time without the knowledge of responsible party organisations, though he couldn't say how detailed that knowledge would be. The RSHA itself, he thought, did not use the party leadership core channels such as the Gauleiters and Kreisleiters to transmit orders. It had its own administrative chain. As an example of RSHA command flow, he described how an order from Himmler to Kaltenbrunner, for example to combat enemy saboteurs dropped by air, would be passed to Department 4, drafted into a directive, signed either by Müller or Kaltenbrunner and sent to regional officers, with reports returning up the same chain to Himmler. He gave 2 concrete examples. First, a hypothetical case of anti-sabotage orders moving from Himmler to Kaltenbrunner to Department 4 and down to regional officers, with reports returning. Second, he showed that an actual order after the 20th of July 1944 plot to arrest leaders of leftist parties. In the latter, Himmler instructed Kaltenbrunner, who passed the order to Department 4. There a decree was prepared, signed by Kaltenbrunner, sent to regional officers, and reports of arrest returned up the chain. Ohlendorf also spoke about his knowledge of the defendants. He said that he had first met Kaltenbrunner on the journey from Berlin to Himmler's headquarters when Kaltenbrunner was to be appointed chief of the security police and SD. Before that, he only knew of him, but he hadn't met him personally. He had official and private contacts with him afterwards, but he didn't know Kaltenbrunner's specific views on the Jewish question. On the church, he said Kaltenbrunner rejected the anti-church line and agreed with him that an understanding with the church was necessary. He didn't know Kaltenbrunner's position on the liquidation of civilian prisoners or parachutists. He stated that it had always been the task of the SD, both before and under Kaltenbrunner, to provide criticism to the leadership, and that Kaltenbrunner supported this tendency. He thought it too general to say that Kaltenbrunner had no authority to issue executive orders, since Müller, who did have authority in many matters, was formerly Kaltenbrunner's subordinate in the RSHA. Orders from Himmler to Müller were also binding on Kaltenbrunner, and Müller was obliged to inform him. He said it was certain that in concentration camp matters, Himmler reserved final decisions on both commitment and release, down to the last washerwoman. He could not say with certainty whether Kaltenbrunner had any independent authority in these decisions. He had never seen an original order signed by Kaltenbrunner for the liquidation of sabotage troops. He also could not confirm that, after Heydrich's death, a milder course under Kaltenbrunner took hold, as he lacked concrete proof. Regarding Speer, he knew that Speer took steps, contrary to Hitler's orders, to prevent the destruction of industrial and other installations, and he believed these measures might have affected some western areas, but by the time he learned of them, they no longer applied to the east. He didn't know of any attempt by Speer on Hitler's life or plans by Speer to surrender Himmler to the Allies. He stated that he was aware that the conspirators of the 20th of July 1944 had intended to keep Speer at the head of his ministry. He had been told that in their proposed post-coup organisation, Speer was to remain responsible for armaments. He commented that, given Speer's close connection to Legion Reich authorities and his contributions to decision-making, it was difficult to see him as non-political, though he was also regarded as a technical expert. Regarding Hjalmar Schacht, he said that files classified Schacht as hostile to the party as from around 1937-38 onwards. He assumed that Schacht's arrest after the 20th of July 1944 coup was an attempt to use that event as a pretext finally to bring Schacht to trial, as he was known to be opposed to the party. He believed the suspicion of Schacht's involvement remained unproven. He did not know who ordered Schacht's arrest, but did not think any subordinate authority could have done so. He assumed it was ordered at least by Himmler and perhaps by Hitler. On the Reich cabinet, he said that he was convinced the order for mass murders did not originate from the cabinet, and that he did not believe that it had been communicated to the individual cabinet members. He also repeated that the liquidation order for Soviet citizens came from Hitler, and it was to be carried out by Himmler. Asked whether this order accorded with Nazi policy or contradicted it, he answered that in practical terms it represented the policy laid down by the Führer, but it didn't conform with the idea of National Socialism. On the question of legality and obedience, he said that he had scruples about the orders, but believed it inconceivable that its subordinate leader should not carry out orders issued by the leaders of the state to whom he had sworn obedience. He didn't recall any concrete case of a man asking to be excused from executions. He himself excluded men he considered emotionally unfit and sent them home. He didn't believe that those carrying out orders were encouraged under false pretenses about the legality of their actions. In his view, because the orders came from the highest state authority, the question of legality did not arise in the mind of an individual subordinate. In his opinion, refusal to obey would have led to court-martial and an appropriate sentence. He also outlined that the RSHA handled the equipment, weapons and personnel assignments for the Einsatzgruppen. The RSHA provided their armour, weapons and organisational framework. The organisation and personnel department handled appointments. Supply and movement in the field were provided by the army under the agreement he described. Finally, he said that after the retreat from the Caucasus, Einsatzgruppe D effectively ceased to exist in its original form. Its staff went as far as the Caucasus and then returned as Combat Command Bierkampf. This unit was used in operations against partisans. According to him, this unit acted mainly in reconnaissance and fighting roles under the commander of the security police in Ukraine and the higher SS and police leader in Ukraine. For this later period, he could not state with certainty whether executions of civilians continued, but he believed that the later role was that of a combat unit rather than extermination formation. Thus concludes the testimony of Otto Ohlendorf on the 3rd of January 1946. If you want, you can listen to it on the YouTube channel of the Robert H. Jackson Centre, and I'll give you a link below. There it lasts for over 3 hours. The difference between that and my version is that I've omitted the questions as well as the long pauses for translations, repetitions and misunderstandings. However, please do feel free to compare the two versions. In other videos, I shall look at the career of Otto Ohlendorf at his own trial and his execution, as well as aspects of his interrogations, such as on the subject of corruption, as well as his testimony on what Himmler did in the last 3 weeks of his life. I upload now every day at 2000 hours my time. I live in Poland and Germany, so that's 2000 hours Central European time. On Fridays, I do longer videos. On Tuesdays, I do sort of medium length videos. And on other days, I do short videos of up to 3 minutes in length. Although sometimes I change this pattern, I also often do live broadcasts. And to know what I'm doing and when, the best way is to subscribe. I also offer membership of this channel. There are currently over 800 videos. Admittedly, the overwhelming bulk of them are shorts videos, but there are some longer ones, a bit like this there too. The cost of this is £5 or €6 or $6 per month, should you be interested. But for the moment, thanks very much for listening. All the best from me, and bye for now.